In a sense, most of my broadcasting career has been linked to the legacy of war. From the day I stood outside Harry Truman's house in Kansas City, Missouri in 1948, waiting to report his election as president, to the moment I reported the assassination of President Kennedy, a hero of the battle in the Pacific, the Second World War has stood beside me. For CBS, I covered the coronation of a young woman who'd been a motor mechanic during the London Blitz. In my posting to Moscow, I saw the Cold War at close quarters. Later, I reported from Vietnam on a conflict caused by a clash of ideologies, traced back to the meetings of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin at Yalta and Potsdam. In the 1960s, I took President Eisenhower back to the landing beaches in Normandy, and I covered America's space program, which was born from rocket technology pioneered by the Nazis. In the past few years, I've returned to Europe, first to revisit my old haunts in London. It was there when I reported the arrival in Britain of the American Air Force and their daring daylight raids over Germany. And now I've come back to consider what happened when peace broke out, and whether all these years later we can identify the legacy of war.
At Nuremberg, the judges enter to hear the case for the defense in the war crimes trial.
In 1945, the United Press sent me to Nuremberg to cover the trial of Germany's war leaders. Over 60 years ago it was. Yet all those years have not dimmed the memory of darkest periods in world history, when men were taken to the dock to account for their crimes against humanity.
Some organization that would kill them, didn't you?
The story of the Nuremberg Trial has been told so often that we've forgotten the debate that went before. Should Hitler's henchmen be tried in the United States, or in Britain, or even in Russia? Should they be tried at all? Wouldn't summary executions be a better way to deal with the men whose actions had sealed the fate of millions? But at a pre-trial conference in London, the American idea prevailed, that the prosecution should take place on German soil. For all of that summer, London was the focus of the Nuremberg preparation. The Americans, the British, the French, and the Russians haggled over the details, not the least of which were the actual crimes with which the Nazi leaders would be charged.
The Americans led the way, and for the Americans, Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, who was appointed directly by President Truman, he inherited really diplomatic responsibility for the Allied discussions, which had started over the war years, and at London, he was the first among the equals who were the Allies negotiating.
I am convinced that we have an opportunity to bring to a just judgment those who have thought it safe to wage aggressive and ruthless war.
The charges that they begin to draft and they frame focus on three principal crimes, three substantive crimes: the crime of waging aggressive war, the crime of committing crime in war, battlefield crimes or war crimes, and the crime against humanity, the crime of military perpetrators on civilians in nations or even within their own nations. Before London and before the Nuremberg trial that followed, those had never been topics of international agreement or subjects of prosecutions brought against national leaders.
In the end, the London Charter, as it came to be known, provided a framework for the trial that opened here in courtroom 600 on November 20th, 1945. You can imagine the tension on that first day of the trial. Justice Jackson represented the United States. In the way he spoke, the way he conducted the prosecution, would signal how America saw the post-war world, just how serious it was about liberty, justice, and equality for all. So we correspondents hung on every word of his opening statement. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated.
I remember hearing those words, admiring his rhetoric, and being inspired by them. I will never forget them. It was a new concept. Crimes against humanity, so far as I know, had no place in the legal vocabulary of the time. I was one of two who passed out the indictments, and we read the charges, which were conspiracy, crimes against the peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And the defendants, as well as we, were some at a loss to know just what that meant.
Day in and day out, I took my seat at these trials, just feet from 22 men who had caused the death of millions. I can remember even now how I felt. I wanted to spit on them. Sounds strange, I suppose, to say that. Perhaps I felt that spitting on them would be a mark of how low I thought they were. To the readers of my United Press dispatches, I sought to convey the mood in the courtroom, the madness of Rudolf Hess, the arrogance of Hermann Goering, the chilling testimony of Rudolf Hess, who presided over the gas chambers of Auschwitz for 3 years. We watched film of the concentration camps, footage taken by American cameramen when the camps were liberated. The shock was all around me. Some of the defendants put their heads in their hands. Others sobbed openly. Like my colleagues on the press benches, I felt that at that moment, 9 days into the trial, the fate of these monsters was sealed.
We saw mountains of bodies. We saw people being tortured. We saw what went on inside the concentration camps. Goering put his hand to his mouth and said in an audible voice, "Oh, this is nothing but propaganda, like Goebbels could have done." But the effect on the rest of the defense counsel, the prosecutors, and the judges was so extraordinary that Lord Lawrence had to adjourn the court. It was impossible to carry on the proceedings.
The story of the Holocaust that featured in the Nuremberg Trial shocked the world. In London, the Daily Express mounted an exhibition of photographs from the concentration camps. Londoners studied them in silence. In the cinemas, newsreels were hard to bear. Some audiences left in tears.
What the Nuremberg trial process did for the man in the street, even in the short term, was start to develop a record, a factual understanding of what the Nazis had done. And that became important early. What it did for history was provide a historical record, which, of course, is the basis of our understanding of Holocaust. It's what makes Holocaust denial a crackpot venture rather than an intellectually respectable position in a debate. And it began to build the architecture of modern international law.
At the end, Hermann Goering, Hitler's deputy, cheated the hangman's noose by swallowing a cyanide pill. 10 of those on trial were hanged. 7 were jailed and 3 exonerated. The trials of lesser figures followed, but Hitler's high command had been brought to justice in an international court.
The United States, in more recent times, has not been at the forefront of developing modern international law in the legacy of Nuremberg. Indeed, has been the principal opponent nation of developments like the International Criminal Court. And that's a sad irony. But Nuremberg is a blink of 60 years is really only a couple of blinks of time. Robert Jackson had a great line. He said, the meaning of Nuremberg will come to be understood in the century run, and we're only 2/3 of the way along that century run. So I would say Nuremberg is in some ways a work in progress.
Life in London in 1945 was grim. In America, London was the headline story. But behind the headlines, there were identical stories in Birmingham, Southampton, Plymouth, Portsmouth, Coventry. Thousands of people were displaced. In London's Blitz, the bombs made no distinction between factory and house, young and old, royalty and commoner. Everyone was in it together. But few thought about the task of rebuilding this great city after the war.
The archive at London's Guildhall, the only stone building to survive the Great Fire of 1666 and the Blitz, holds a remarkable aerial map drawn by the artist Cecil Brown in 1945. It shows the city from the southeast and the damage caused by 5 years of bombing.
The detail on this drawing is absolutely brilliant. It's better than any photograph.
60 years later, it inspired the historian Maureen Waller to write about life in the debris of war.
What a miracle it was that St. Paul's Cathedral survived. And of course it became a symbol of our survival throughout the war. Now, with these vast open spaces, you had the opportunity at last to do away with these original plots, to buy up whole sites and build wider streets, buildings, allowing more light, more air to the people that were working in the city.
The British had started thinking about rebuilding London long before VE Day. In 1943, the government appointed Patrick Abercrombie to draw up plans which would not only restore the homes that had been lost, but also take advantage of the damage done by the Blitz to create a new and better city.
I think what Londoners wanted after the war was decent homes, jobs for the population. After all, there was a recollection of the 1930s, that they wanted open space and that they wanted just the conditions to start life again. Abercrombie believed that London had become a large amorphous mass and that what was needed was to reopen and rediscover, I should say, the old urban communities which he believed were still there.
The vision of Sir Patrick Abercrombie was almost immediately overtaken by events. Returning residents simply weren't prepared to wait years for an orderly rebuilding of their city. By 1950, the British had recovered its nerve on the world stage, exporting everything from jet airliners to Harris Tweed. But at home, their grand plans had fallen behind.
There was no real start on town centre redevelopment in any general sense until more or less the late 1950s or early 1960s. By this stage, private enterprise, private development had taken place. There had been a building boom in the private sector, and many things had already been built. And that meant that the opportunities you had of the clean sweep were then limited.
As Londoners started to imagine how their neighbourhoods would be rebuilt, they put their faith not in politicians who'd seen them through 5 years of war, but in a government that promised new houses, schools, hospitals, indeed a complete health service. The old order was out.
In July 1945, we correspondents in Europe were staggered when British voters rejected Winston Churchill as their peacetime prime minister. They favored a Labour government led by Clement Attlee. it became clear that the country thought Churchill had been the right man in the right place in 1940, but now they had hopes of a new life, a life they believed only socialist politicians could deliver.
The mood was basically enormous relief and a determination to do better after the Second World War than we'd done after the First World War. And, you know, to build a world fit for heroes, as the saying was.
The Labor government of Clement Attlee provided new schools and hospitals, even a complete free national health service in 1948, something America is still arguing about. But unlike the United States, it struggled to provide homes for Londoners bombed out in the Blitz and for servicemen and women picking up their lives after 5 years at the front.
The government created a series of new towns, including Hemel Hempstead, Stevenage and Harlow, in the countryside north of London.
Harlow was built after the Second World War to provide houses and jobs for bombed-out London. It was designed by Sir Frederick Gibbard, and it was initially to be a self-contained town. That meant you could get everything from Harlow without going outside the town. Jobs were provided in 2 industrial estates on the outskirts of town, and the whole important part of it was the family. It was designed around the family.
Family town. A town of young marrieds with babies and small children. Because of the boom in babies, Pram Town was the label given by the press some years ago. There is still a baby boom, and now there are grandparents too.
Happy days, happy days.
Elsie and Bill Penny were among the first to move into Harlow, and they're still here.
It is, no, 50.
They'd beaten the Blitz, but decided in 1947 that London was not the place in which to bring up a family.
We determined that we were coming to Harlow for a new start, a good place to bring the 2 daughters up, Barbara and Pat. But there were a lot of the people who had lived with their mums and dads and aunts and uncles all in the same road. And when they came down here, they thought they were miles and miles away, you know.
Harlow began life in 1947, but by the 1950s it was housing thousands of people who'd endured years and years of living back to back in London and the agony of the Blitz. But the new towns were small compared with America's way of housing the men and women who'd won the war. Take Levittown on Long Island, just outside New York. A vast estate of prefabs built in just a few years by the enterprising Levitt family.
When Levitt finished, 17,447 houses. But what got them there was the assembly line process. It was so efficient that at their peak, they built 30 houses a day.
Here is the most extraordinary image. This is the plot.
Yes.
And it's steel cabinet, refrigerator, corner cupboard, automatic washing machine, picket fence. It's all there.
Isn't it wonderful?
Everything you could ever have dreamed of.
Absolutely. And you know what I dreamed most of? The washing machine. The washing machine. That was wonderful. After 5 years of going to a laundromat, it was like the joy of my life.
For Fred and Dorothy Joes, who'd met at a wartime field hospital in France, Levittown was the answer to their prayers.
I was never going to move to Levittown because I thought it was eventually it would be a slum area because it was so inexpensive to buy here at that time. But we couldn't afford anything else because neither one of us had been working. We came out of service.
We looked at these places, they were big. You know, we had a small bedroom and a kitchen and share a bath for $17.50 a week. Now it was $60 a month for Levittown. So we said right away. So my parents said, "You're going way out there?"
We didn't buy it at that time. We rented it because I didn't want to buy it. But after we moved in, then I realized this was a good place for us to be.
By 1947, the United States had never been stronger, and there were those in President Truman's administration who believed that that strength should be used to help humanity. Truman's Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, realized that the war in Europe had disrupted trade in industrialized nations. It had damaged commerce, and commerce was something America knew about. George Marshall, child of the 19th century, soldier of the First World War, chief of staff in the Second, had a plan that the United States could give to the world.
The Marshall Plan was nurtured by the State Department and announced on graduation day at one of America's leading university campuses, where thousands of soldiers were benefiting from the GI Bill, a subsidized program of college education.
Harvard had been trying to give Marshall an honorary degree for several years, and so Marshall gets to kill two birds with one stone. Now, Dean Acheson said no one listens to these commencement addresses, but Marshall had a plan in mind. In fact, I've brought the speech text with me. This is the first time it has been out of our archive at the George C. Marshall Center and in Harvard Yard since it was delivered.
And when you say speech, I mean, this is the actual document that he wrote, and this is his handwriting, delivered at 2:50 p.m., June the 5th, signed by Marshall.
This still bears the folds from carrying it in his pocket. When he accepted the idea of coming here to get a degree, he did tell the president of Harvard that he might want to make a short address.
Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos.
With a low-key speech, given at such an offbeat occasion, the world might have missed George Marshall's plan for the rebuilding of Europe. But in London, Britain's Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin responded immediately.
Of 16 European countries, representing 218 million people, come together to the Marshall Plan. Despite a boycott by Russia and 7 Soviet-dominated countries, the meeting moves ahead full speed as Britain's Ernest Bevin, unanimously elected chairman, opens the sessions. Acting on
He heard Marshall's broadcast 3 days after Marshall actually made it, and he realized that this was a chance to get Europe rebuilt. He got in touch with his European colleagues and got them to try to agree on a program for working together to rebuild Western Europe, and of course he succeeded.
As Truman bids goodbye to Attlee and his new Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin.
We had a Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, who came from a background to which all this talk was completely new. I mean, but because he had a very shrewd, practical, patriotic mind, he saw the point. He grasped the importance of the American initiative, and of course did his best to shove it forward and to make sure that the whole of Europe benefited from it.
Paris, too, jumped at the chance of aid, even though its coalition government included communists who'd fought bravely in the resistance. Even the Russians came to the table in the early negotiations, but left when they realized that they wouldn't get the massive reparations they'd demanded from a defeated Germany. Moscow wanted vengeance. Washington simply wanted peace. The bill came to almost $30 billion. In the end, Congress approved just under $20 billion, still a huge contribution to the rebuilding of Europe.
The yes countries went to work and drew up a kind of blueprint for recovery.
The Americans are convinced, as are the British, convinced that Germany cannot be suppressed, cannot be left out of Europe, because otherwise the clever Germans would play Europe against East Europe and come out on top again. So what we needed was for the French and the Germans and the British to agree to some kind of cooperation. Now, this was very difficult to convince the French that the Germans could be trusted not to invade for the 4th time in 100 years.
Of the atomic age, the delegates are realistic. But remembering these, they must also be prepared to surrender if need be.
The Americans realized that if they didn't help Western Europe to recover from the damage of the war, it might well turn communist. And that would have been absolutely disastrous to have the Russians going right up to the east side of the Atlantic Ocean. So that they had a very strong interest in doing it, but they also had a strong desire, you know, to help their allies.
By 1950, with the start of the Korean War, martial aid was increasingly being spent on military hardware. With the recovery of Europe well underway, governments outside the communist bloc turned their thoughts toward mutual protection. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was formed in 1949. The Marshall Plan had done its job. Now Washington had a new challenge: how to cope with the men behind the Iron Curtain who had settled in for a long Cold War.
Andrei Gromyko, representing the Soviet Union, abruptly walked out of the United Nations Security Council.
I think you could see the Cold War coming at Yalta, which was the big international conference at the end of the war. And the Russians published pamphlets, made speeches, which made it absolutely clear they didn't believe it was possible to build a world society unless it was run by the Soviet Union and was communist.
That the Cold War, as it came to be known, was a legacy of the Second World War is indisputable. The evidence is contained in millions of words in countless documents on both sides of the Atlantic, in words, but also in actions.
Now that the world has moved on and most of the missiles have been packed away, where is the evidence on the ground?
It's here at Molesworth, the air base in England from where I flew with the 303rd Heavy Bombardment Group as they mounted their daylight raids over Germany. 65 years after I climbed aboard a B-17 to report a raid which hit one of the nerve centers of Nazi Germany, I've come back to find out what happened to the air base from which I flew.
Molesworth is the operational hub, and it's where we do the mission support from for all of the ongoing operations. Not only in the
I was met by the base commander, Colonel Jack Jones, and discovered that this airfield, which we correspondents were only allowed to say was somewhere in England, was also a player in the Cold War.
With the removal of the weapons themselves, right out there to your left is the old Gamma area. You can see the bunkers.
Oh, yes.
That's where the ground-launched cruise missiles were located.
It's chilling to think that the missiles at Molesworth were part of an escalation in the standoff between the United States and Russia.
Bikini Atoll and first films of Baker Day, the underwater explosion of the 5th atomic bomb.
A climate of fear had been created throughout the world, almost equal to that of the Second World War itself. It was a standoff that settled into a ridiculous situation. The idea was that neither side would use its nuclear arsenal because to do so would provoke a response from the other that would signal the end of the world. It was not lost on the peoples of the world that the acronym for the expression mutual assured destruction was MAD.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire!
From around 1958, 59 onwards, we went into a system that reacted to international tension. If there was a possibility that things were looking a little bit tricky between Russia and the West, then we then started going into a system where there was permanent quick reaction alert force ready to go. So each base had between 2 and 4 aircraft at 15 minutes readiness. And then we'd go to 5 minutes readiness, which meant that you could start engines and all 4 would get airborne, all bombed up and ready to go within it took about 3 minutes. We had what was called a go, no-go line, so that we knew that we had the weapon on board. We didn't know where anybody else was because we were in our own aircraft with our own target, and we knew that we continued to the go, no-go line. And if we had not heard on our radio the message from the bomber controller saying continue, then we would automatically turn back. But if we got the message to go, yes, then we went. And I don't believe anybody would have said, no, I don't like this, I'm going home.
From the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which haunted America, to the anti-nuclear protests at Greenham Common in England, the Cold War heated up or cooled down in direct relation to the success of talks aimed at multilateral disarmament.
Khrushchev and Eisenhower is brief.
The Russians developed a style of saying one thing and doing another. They raced the Americans not only to the ultimate nuclear weapon, moving from splitting the atom to fusing it for greater impact in the hydrogen bomb, but also into space. Technology advanced, faces changed, but the rhetoric stayed the same. For Roosevelt and Stalin, read President Eisenhower and Premier Nikita Khrushchev.
Here now is the White House meeting. After the picture taking, they'll talk for an hour and 45 minutes. Khrushchev has brought a present, a baseball-shaped model of the inner sphere of the Soviet rocket which shot the moon. Inside is a Soviet coat of arms. Thus, these momentous hours run their course, events crowded with the imponderables of history.
As talks went on in Washington, the British government's advisors reported that a single hydrogen bomb detonated at 20,000 feet above London would start 100,000 fires while covering the city with radiation. If 10 bombs were used around the country, the government reckoned they might kill 12 million and injure 4 million. And the warning for Londoners? An hour at the most, probably 20 minutes, possibly as little as 3 minutes. Though Britain felt itself to be in the front line and eventually voted to develop its own independent nuclear capability, it favoured quiet diplomacy. The United States took a tougher stance, parading a mixture of planes and missiles that were based not only at home, but also in the European countries that it had helped to liberate 15 years earlier.
All the way through, the British instinct would be to talk, and to listen and to look for opportunities, and the American instinct was rather rougher. But these were not confrontations. These were matters of emphasis, of balance, because everybody was trying actually was trying both to be diplomatic but also to be strong.
60 years and we live still in the shadow of the last World War. When London was attacked by terrorists, people spoke of the Blitz spirit. And all around us are the international institutions that were championed by the United States in an age when Washington was clear about its role in the world.
We still live in these institutions, but they are rusty. At the end of the Cold War, when President Bush Sr., who was, in my view, a great president, but he talked about a new world order as if it existed. It didn't exist. We were still sheltering in these institutions, and they are not proving entirely apt for the world in which we now live. From the superpower, at the moment, from the Americans, that kind of leadership towards institution building, which we need, and I don't quite see where else it's going to come from. The legacy of that period is still with us, but in institutions which are now not useless, but they need powerful adjustment in order to meet what the 21st century in which we live.
The wartime relationship between the United States and Britain was given the chance to help create a new and better world as a legacy of war. Born on a battleship off Nova Scotia in August 1941, when Churchill and Roosevelt produced the Atlantic Charter, it has loomed large in every post-war analysis of the ties between London and Washington.
Great Britain, Russia, and the United States met as friends and allies.
What we have seen since the Second World War, under the title special relationship, in fact, a much more complex, a much richer relationship than this rather bland phrase might lead you to believe, and also a much more uneven relationship than the phrase might lead you to believe. The fact of the matter is that the relationship is extraordinarily dynamic. It does have unique features of intimacy and closeness, and it's growing all the time. But again, the notion of a special relationship doesn't do justice, I don't think, to this dynamism. It's a bit like an iceberg. What you see above the surface is the clashes of personality, the rows here and there, the tugging and the pulling, and the unevenness in the relationship. What you see below the water, if you plunge down, is a much larger mass, which is the cultural relationship, the economic relationship, the investment relationship, which is quite extraordinary, the relationship, the intelligence relationship. Put all these things together and you have a growing and dynamic mass, but an awful lot of it is invisible to the eye.
We were acting the part of a junior partner. Even Churchill, with his background, had to accept that he was junior to Roosevelt. And he learned, we see that in his own writings, he learned with reluctance how to play the part of a junior partner. Attlee was never anything else, but you saw at the time of the Korean War, how occasionally the junior partner exercised an influence. Macmillan, it came naturally to him. It's an art which I'm afraid has dribbled away now, but the special relationship was something to which we attached huge importance, perhaps too much importance. But its importance, its value rested on us learning the art of the junior partner.
One of the things that I realized in Washington is that you can't assume this intimacy will continue. From an American point of view, the British have increasingly to validate themselves as the kind of partner with whom they can share secrets and confidences. Obviously, after 9/11, with Britain standing shoulder to shoulder with the United States, the US intelligence service probably came to us in the first instance in creating resources to fight the war against terrorism. Similarly on the military level as well. But again, I used to say to my staff, don't assume this is for eternity. We have to validate ourselves with the Americans and they with us.
Easy as it may be to dismiss World War II as a war from another age, it still exerts a powerful effect on the modern link between Washington and Molesworth has become the highly secret Joint Intelligence Center in a new battle that has replaced the Cold War, the fight against international terrorism. The center is restricted even to ex-war correspondents, but its existence is evidence that whatever the critics may say, Washington and London are still inextricably linked. Apart from the missile launch pads, all that reminds us that this was once a base for American airmen far away from home is a memorial to those members of the 303rd Heavy Bombardment Group who never came home. And as the young Marines of this base in their off-duty clothes pose for a photograph with someone from way back when, I'm reminded that there is one other thing you need to know about Molesworth. At the end of World War II, it held a poignant record. More American personnel married English girls here than anywhere else in Britain. For 50 years, what the air crew of this base, many of them my friends, did in their spare time was to be the hidden legacy of war. The story of GI brides and GI babies is the story of two countries locked in an embrace that only just saved the world from tyranny, survived the Cold War, and in a new century came to be tested as never before. By 1944, in the run-up to D-Day, 1.5 million men had crowded into the south of England. Camped on the edge of market towns and villages, they were camouflaged by the New Forest. They had to remember to drive on the left and to mind their manners.
That means an end to civilian supplies. If you were a Britisher, you wouldn't expect your girl to use lipstick. There isn't any, except what we bring over as bait. She wouldn't be smartly dressed, for clothes are rationed, severely rationed. It's very unlikely she wears stockings, for if she bought a pair of stockings a month, that would be all the clothes of any kind she could buy.
When they came in 1942, the Americans were welcomed with great relief that at last they'd entered the war. They were greeted with curiosity and jubilation, a little cynicism and scepticism from British men, because of course the Americans were, shall I say, better built than British men at the time. They looked very smart in their uniforms, they had more money, so they inevitably attracted women. They were a magnet to women. And they were, of course, great fun to be with. They had their own club in London at the corner of Shaftesbury Avenue called Rainbow Corner. And they loved partying, dancing. They had plenty of money and they were very generous with it. They liked to fling it about and have a good time. 80,000 British women married Americans. They were getting very impatient by the end of 1945 because they still hadn't been over to the States. They were waiting for the American government to organise this. And some of them actually took lessons at Rainbow Corner. They gave them lessons on all sorts of things, from the American Constitution to the climate, a certain amount of American cooking, all sorts of things like that, to keep them occupied until such time as they were transported to the States.
Although GIs had arrived in Britain by sea in 1942, at the end of the war they sailed home direct from ports on mainland Europe. So their British brides and babies might not have seen them since they left for Normandy in June 1944. And before they could be reunited, immigration laws in the United States had to be amended, which would take until December 1945.
No one knows exactly how many babies the GIs left behind.
40 years on, the children born of wartime relationship between Britain and the United States wanted to know where they came from. Among them was Pauline Natividad.
Very soon after my mum died, I missed my mum desperately, and it was at that point I felt I needed to know my dad, who my dad was. I only knew that he was Paul Natividad, an American serviceman from World War II, had been a medic. Didn't know where he was from in America, but it was the turning point after Mum died that I felt that I needed a dad. I know I was around 13 and Grandmother gave me a package with these photographs in, and some letters and little greeting cards from my dad to my mum. At last I had a picture of him. And many times over the next few years I would look at the picture and look at myself in the mirror and do I look like him? And it was just not knowing. I mean, that said London 45, but I didn't know where he was from then on. I had no idea.
First you think it was Paul Natividad, then you found that it was Pilar. But first of all you spoke to brother, Victor.
He told me that my father, our father, was alive and well and actually living in Arizona. And he was just absolutely shocked that I'd been searching for him, and also that I wanted to know him. So in less than a month of first talking to my dad on the phone, I'm flying out to El Paso, Texas, all on my own, to meet my father for the first time. The minute I went into El Paso Airport, and there were a group of people holding a sign, "Welcome, Pauline, we love you."
He's a lovely guy.
I just scanned the group. I knew that was my dad at the back of the group, although he was a tall, grey-haired man. I just went over and just hugged, and we took it from there. The next few days, I felt in my life forever, that he had been my dad always, and just not too far from me. It's like he was always there.
The date was May 12, 1945. The war in Europe had ended 4 days earlier. At London's ancient Guildhall, they gathered to give the freedom of the city to the supreme commander of Allied forces in Northern Europe. In his acceptance speech, General Eisenhower said he had a particular affection for London, where so many of the important decisions about D-Day had been made. And he recalled the first GIs arrived in 1942. With awe, our men gazed upon the empty spaces where once had stood buildings erected by the toil and sweat of peaceful folk. Our eyes rounded as we saw your women serving quietly and efficiently in almost every kind of war effort, even with flak batteries. We became accustomed to the warning sirens which seemed to compel from the native Londoner not even a single hurried step. Gradually, we drew closer together until we became true partners in war. 20 years later, I took General Eisenhower, now a former president, on a tour of the landing beaches of Normandy. And both of us were deeply moved by the way the French respected the memory of the greatest one-day invasion in history. On June 6th, veterans still come, fewer year by year, to remember their friends who didn't go home. In the heat of early summer, the British, Canadians, and Americans are remembered here in simple ceremonies that tug at the heartstrings, and in graveyards that will be forever a home away from home. In an age when American military personnel killed in foreign wars are respectfully flown home, it comes as a surprise to a new generation to learn that victims of the Second World War stayed here in Europe, a world away from home. Here at the Cambridge American Cemetery in England, kept spotless by the American Battle Monuments Commission, the Alconbury Girl Scouts helped tend the graves of those who didn't go home.
The 5,000 names on the wall of the missing here, the thing that strikes me about it is just the sheer magnitude of the number of names, and there's a story behind each name. And then, of course, the 3,812 that are buried here, every one of those burial plots has a significant story, and the story's magnified because there are marriages and girlfriends and relationships that there's still contact going on today.
In every state, in New York, Ohio, Minnesota, my gosh, there's just one after another, isn't it? One after another, and hundreds after another. Unbelievable. It ought to tell us something about a future that can only look forward to another one of those. You can't have that. You got to think of something other than that future. You've got to have a future of peace, where peace is not represented by the dead, but by the survivors and those who have made a peaceful world out of what looked like an eternal war. I'm thinking, my God, my God, my God. In the future they had, and they ended up here, heroes, saviors of our nation, our future. And we had to take that from them. It's too much. Just too damn much. If 60 years of peace, imperfect as they may be, means the lessons of the Second World War have been learned, if alliances forged in a hot war and refined in the Cold War that followed have made the world a safer place, if those who disparage the United States for its foreign policy in the 21st century can remember a time when it came to the aid of millions, then the ultimate sacrifice of these soldiers was not made in vain.
Legacy of War is available on DVD for $24.99 plus shipping. To order, call 1-800-336-1917 or write to the address on your screen.